There is a moment in every soldier's life, not the moment they put on the uniform, not the moment they fire their first weapon, but the quiet, invisible moment when they realize the war never truly left them. It lives in their shoulders. It lives in the way they scan a room before they sit down. It lives in their skin. Literally, sometimes in their skin. This is not a story about a hero. This is a story about a man who stopped believing he was one, and the single afternoon that reminded him and everyone around him exactly who he had always been. The summer of 2018 was one of the hottest on record in the small town of Deering, Georgia. The kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt and turned every afternoon into something heavy and slow, like the whole world was moving through warm water. People stayed inside. They kept their blinds drawn. They moved carefully, conserving energy, conserving patience. Marcus Webb moved carefully too, but not because of the heat. He was 43 years old, and he walked with a slight drag in his left leg, a souvenir from a night in Kandahar that he never talked about and never would. He wore old jeans, a plain white t-shirt that had been washed so many times it had gone thin and soft, and a pair of beaten work boots that had seen 3 different states and 1 foreign country. His hair had grown longer than military standard, a deliberate choice after years of not having a choice. His beard was thick, touched with gray at the corners of his jaw. He carried a worn canvas bag over one shoulder and walked like a man who had no particular destination, which on that Tuesday afternoon he didn't. To anyone watching from the parking lot of the Deering Community Center, he looked like a man down on his luck. Maybe homeless. Maybe just passing through. Maybe both. That was the problem. Marcus had been out of the army for 14 months. 14 months of sleeping in a real bed and waking up to civilian silence instead of reveille. 14 months of grocery shopping and watching television and try to remember how to exist in a world that didn't require him to be constantly ready for something terrible to happen. He was staying at a transitional housing unit on the east side of town, a place run by a nonprofit that helped veterans find their footing after service. He had a small room, a shared kitchen, and a counselor named Diane who met with him every Thursday and asked him how he was sleeping. Not well, he always said. Getting better, he always added. He had come to the community center that afternoon because they were hosting a free lunch program. He wasn't there for the food, not really. He had enough money for food. But the transitional housing was quiet during the day, too quiet, and the silence had a way of filling up with things he didn't want to think about. Noise helped. People helped. Even strangers eating sandwiches at folding tables helped. He was walking across the parking lot, cutting through from the side street, when a security guard spotted him. The guard's name was Carl Briggs. He was 26, heavy-set, took his job seriously in a way that young men with a small amount of authority sometimes do. He had been warned, apparently, that there had been some incidents in the area, a few individuals loitering around the property, some minor disturbances, and he had been told to keep the area clear of anyone who didn't belong. Carl looked at Marcus Webb. The long hair, the worn clothes, the canvas bag, the slow walk, and made a decision before he asked a single question. Hey, sir, you can't be back here. Marcus stopped. He had learned, over 14 months, to stop immediately when addressed by someone in any kind of uniform, even a security polo. It was a reflex, not fear. He turned and looked at Carl without changing his expression. I'm going to lunch program, Marcus said. His voice was low, and even the kind of voice that had spent years giving orders in loud places and had learned not to waste volume. Lunch program is for registered participants, Carl said, walking toward him. You need to have a voucher. Do you have a voucher? Marcus didn't have a voucher. He hadn't known he needed one. The flyer he had seen on the bulletin board at the transitional housing unit hadn't mentioned a voucher. He told Carl this. Carl looked at the canvas bag. What's in the bag? Marcus paused. Personal items. I'm going to need you to open it. Something moved behind Marcus's eyes. Not anger, not exactly, but something older and more complicated than anger. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name. He held Carl's gaze for a moment. Then he set the bag down on the ground, unzipped it, and held it open. Inside was a library book, a water bottle, a small notepad, a phone charger, and a folded piece of paper with his counselor Diane's number on it. Carl looked at the bag. He looked at Marcus. Then he looked past Marcus toward the street, already moving on in his mind, already having decided this man was a problem to be redirected rather than a person to be spoken to. I'm going to have to ask you to move along, Carl said. You can't be on this property without proper documentation. Marcus zipped the bag. He picked it up. He looked at Carl one more time, really looked at him the way a man looks at someone when he is deciding whether the moment is worth more than his peace. And then he nodded slowly and turned to walk away. He was 10 steps away when he heard another voice. Carl. The voice came from the entrance of the community center, where a man had just stepped outside through the glass doors. He was perhaps 60 years old, tall, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of posture that isn't maintained. It's grown over decades into the spine itself. He wore civilian clothes, gray slacks, and a blue button-down, but there was nothing civilian about the way he stood. He had a coffee cup in one hand, and he was looking across the parking lot with an expression that was calm and absolutely focused. His name was Colonel Raymond Delaney, retired. He had spent 31 years in the United States Army, had served in 2 wars, and was now on the board of the nonprofit that ran both the Transitional Housing Unit and the Community Center's Veteran Outreach programs. He had come by that afternoon to review some paperwork and had stepped outside to get some air. He had watched the entire exchange from a doorway. Carl, he said again, and this time Carl turned around. Come here a moment. Carl walked toward him, and Colonel Delaney spoke to him quietly, and whatever he said made Carl glance back at Marcus with a different expression than the one he'd been wearing before. But Delaney wasn't looking at Carl anymore. He was looking at Marcus Webb, who had stopped walking, not because he'd been told to, but because something in that second voice had caught him, some frequency or weight that the body recognizes before the mind does. Delaney walked across the parking lot. He walked like a man with time, unhurried, deliberate, each step placed with intention. He stopped about 6 feet from Marcus and looked at him, not up and down the way Carl had assessing threat or status, but directly, the way you look at someone when you're actually trying to see them. And then Delaney's eyes moved to Marcus's forearms. Marcus's t-shirt sleeve stopped just below the shoulder, and his forearms were exposed in the afternoon sun. They were covered in tattoos, not the scattered, impulsive kind, but the deliberate, meaningful kind, the kind that tell a story if you know how to read them. On his right forearm, an eagle with wings spread, sharp and detailed, the globe and anchor marine, except it wasn't Marine, it was Army, and anyone who knew the difference could see the 75th Ranger Regiment scroll worked into the design. On his left forearm, a series of dates, coordinates, and below them, 7 names arranged in a careful column. Delaney read those names. His jaw moved slightly, the way it does when you read something silently that you feel. He looked up at Marcus. 75th Rangers, he said. It wasn't a question. Marcus looked at the man in front of him. He took in the posture, the way the man had walked, the way he was standing. Some things cannot be hidden by civilian clothes. Yes, sir, he said. He didn't know why he added the sir. He just did. Delaney nodded slowly. Those 7 names on your arm. Marcus said nothing. You carry them everywhere. It was a statement, not a question, and Marcus felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked in a particular position for a very long time, and had just moved just slightly like a door being tested from the inside. Every day, Marcus said quietly. Delaney extended his hand. Raymond Delaney, Colonel, retired, 1st Cavalry Division. Marcus took the hand. The handshake was not the kind you exchange at business meetings. It was the kind that passes something between people, an acknowledgement, a recognition of shared weight. Marcus Webb, he said, Sergeant 1st Class, retired 14 months. 14 months, Delaney repeated. How's that going? Marcus almost said fine. The word was right there, automatic, trained in. Instead, something in the afternoon light and the directness of this man's eyes made him say something different. Some days better than others, he said. Delaney nodded like that was the most reasonable answer he'd ever heard. Come inside, he said. Have some coffee. The lunch program's good today. Real food, not just sandwiches. And I want to hear about those coordinates on your arm, if you're willing. Marcus stood in the parking lot for a moment, the canvas bag over his shoulder, the sun hot on the back of his neck. He thought about 14 months of quiet rooms and Thursday sessions with Diane, and the word fine said so many times it had lost all its shape. He thought about 7 names on his arm. He thought about a parking lot in Kandahar, the weight of a man across his shoulders, the sound of a radio crackling through smoke. He looked at Colonel Raymond Delaney, who was waiting, not impatiently, not with pity, but with the steady calm of a man who understood exactly what it meant to carry things that couldn't be put down. Okay, Marcus said, and he walked inside. What happened in the next 4 hours would not make the news. It would not be recorded anywhere official. There would be no ceremony, no commendation, no moment of grand public recognition. Just 2 soldiers and a table and coffee that had been sitting on the burner a little too long, and a conversation that moved slowly at first and then faster, finding its rhythm the way all real conversations do, not in the dramatic moments, but in the pauses between them. Delaney asked about the coordinates. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Then he talked. He talked about a village in Logar Province, a compound at the end of a dirt road that turned out to be something different than the intelligence had indicated. He talked about moving through a doorway and the silence that followed, a particular kind of explosion, not the roaring silence of movies, but a real silence, the kind that is texture, the kind that settles on you like something physical. He talked about 6 men going in and the math of who came out. He didn't talk about everything. Some things don't have words yet. Some things are still waiting for the right container. But he talked more than he had in 14 months. And Delaney listened the way old soldiers listen. Not to respond, not to fix, but to witness. Because that's what the living owe the ones who carry the dead. Not solutions. Witness. When Marcus finally stopped talking, the room had gotten quieter around them. The lunch program crowd had thinned. Somewhere in the building, someone was stacking chairs. Delaney leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "You know what you did today?" he said. Marcus waited. "You kept walking when you should have stopped. You opened the bag when you didn't have to. You chose not to make it a bigger thing when you had every right to." Delaney looked at him. "That's not weakness. That's discipline. That's a man who still knows how to carry himself." Marcus said nothing. He looked down at his forearms, at the 7 names in their column, at the dates and coordinates that marked the geography of the worst night of his life. "Those men on your arm," Delaney said, "they'd recognize you. Even like this. Even like this." Marcus turned the phrase over in his mind. In the worn clothes, in the long hair, in the slow walk, in the canvas bag with a library book and a counselor's phone number. Even like this. Something moved in his chest again. That locked thing. That door. He didn't cry. That's not how it works, usually, for men like Marcus. But something released, something quiet, internal like a breath held for a very long time finally let out. "I'm not doing so good," Marcus said. He hadn't said those words out loud since the army. He had said variations of them, careful versions, managed versions. But not those exact words, plain like that, to another person. "I know," Delaney said. "But you came in today. That matters." Outside, the afternoon had started to cool. The heat was breaking, the way it does in Georgia, sometimes dramatically, with a wind off somewhere that smells like rain even when no rain comes. Through the community center windows, the parking lot was orange in the late light. Marcus Webb looked at the window. He thought about the man he had been 10 years ago, certain of his purpose, armored by belonging, surrounded by brothers who knew without being told everything that mattered about him. He thought about how long the road had been from that man to this one. And then he thought about a colonel stepping out of a doorway and reading 7 names on a stranger's arm and walking across a parking lot like he had all the time in the world. Some things find you when you stop expecting them. Some things recognize you before you recognize yourself. The door in Marcus's chest moved again, just a little, and for the first time in 14 months, the quiet in the room did not feel like a threat. It felt like something that might, with time, become a beginning. The next morning, Marcus Webb woke up at 5:14 a.m. The same way he had woken up every morning for the past 14 months. Suddenly, completely, like a switch flipped somewhere deep in his nervous system that no one had told it was safe to turn off. He lay on his back in a narrow bed of his room at the transitional housing unit and stared at the ceiling in the gray pre-dawn light. And he did the thing he always did in those first minutes. He went through the names. 7 names, like a roll call, like a prayer, like a count he had to complete before the day was allowed to start. But this morning, something was different. This morning, when he finished the names, he didn't just lie there in the silence, waiting for the weight of the day to settle over him. This morning, he thought about what Delaney had said. Those men on your arm, they'd recognize you. Even like this. He sat up. He looked at his forearms in the gray light. The ink was dark against his skin, permanent, unchosen in its permanence now the way the events behind it were unchosen. But they were his. All of it was his. And for the first time in a long time, sitting in that small room with the ceiling fan ticking above him, he let himself think about that differently. Not as a weight, not as a debt, but as proof. Proof that he had been there. Proof that those 7 men had existed, had mattered, had been known by at least one person who was still here to remember them. He got up, made coffee in a shared kitchen, and sat at the table with a notepad. Delaney had given him his card. He had also mentioned a program, quietly, not like a pitch, not like a referral, but like a thing he was placing on the table for Marcus to look at if he wanted to. It was called the Warrior to Workforce Initiative, a veteran transition program that Delaney had helped build 3 years earlier. It wasn't a job placement service exactly. It was something more complicated and more human than that. A structured program that connected veterans with mentors in fields related to their skills and experience, helped them navigate the civilian world without having to erase who they were to fit into it. Marcus had nodded when Delaney described it. He hadn't said yes. He hadn't said no. He had taken a card. Now he looked at the card on the table next to his coffee cup. He picked up his pen and wrote at the top of the notepad, "What do I actually know how to do?" He stared at the question for a while. Then he started writing. The list was longer than he expected. He had spent years in a profession that civilians couldn't quite name when they asked him about it at parties, back when he went to parties, and so he had gotten used to underselling it, compressing it, translating it into something safe and digestible for people who had never had to think about the things he thought about. But written down without an audience, the list told a different story. He knew logistics. He knew how to manage personnel under pressure. He knew how to read people. Not in the abstract, soft way the word implies, but specifically, tactically, the way you learn to read people when getting it wrong has consequences measured in blood. He knew how to plan and execute complex operations with incomplete information. He knew how to lead without raising his voice. He knew how to function when everything was going wrong and there was no option to stop. He looked at the list. He thought, these are not useless things. He called the number on the card at 8 a.m. Delaney picked up on the second ring, as if he'd been expecting the call, or as if he always picked up on the second ring. Marcus suspected both were true. "I want to know more about the program," Marcus said. "Good," Delaney said. "Come in Thursday. We meet at the center, 10 o'clock. Bring nothing except yourself." Marcus almost said he'd bring a notepad. Then he thought about what Delaney had said. Bring nothing except yourself. And he understood that the instruction wasn't practical. It was philosophical. Come as you are. Not the prepared version. Not the adjusted version. Not the version that has learned to perform normalcy for civilian audiences. Just come. He went. Thursday morning at the Deering Community Center was different from the Tuesday afternoon Marcus had first stumbled into. The parking lot was full. The main hall had been rearranged, tables moved aside, chairs set up in a loose circle, the kind of arrangement that says we're going to talk to each other, not at each other. There were 11 people in the circle when Marcus arrived. Men and women, ranging from mid-20s to late 50s, all veterans, all at varying points in what Delaney called the crossing, the period between who the military had made them and who the civilian world was asking them to become. Marcus found a chair. He sat in it. He put his hands on his knees. A woman across the circle looked at him and gave him a small nod, the universal signal among veterans that means I see you and you're not alone here and I'm not going to make a big deal about it. He nodded back. Delaney ran the session the way Marcus imagined he had run briefings. Organized, but not rigid. Purposeful, but with room for what couldn't be scheduled. He went around the circle and asked each person not where they had served or what their rank had been, but what they were afraid of right now, in this moment, in this chapter of their life. When it got to Marcus, he looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up. "I'm afraid," he said, "that the best version of me already happened, that the man I was over there is the most I'll ever be, and that everything from here is just smaller." The room was quiet in a particular way, the kind of quiet that forms around a true thing. "That's the most common fear in this room," Delaney said, "and I'm going to tell you all something I tell every group I work with. The best version of you is not a finished product. It is not something you achieved and then lost. It is a capacity, and capacities don't disappear. They wait." Marcus thought about that for a long time. Over the following 3 weeks, he came to every session. He started to know the others, not in the deep, foxhole way he had known his unit, but in a real way, the way you know people when you sit with them in honest circles and no one is pretending. There was a woman named Serena who had been an Army medic for 12 years and was now trying to get her nursing license and kept running into bureaucratic walls that made her feel like the system that had used her skills for a decade now didn't trust those same skills in a civilian building. There was a man named Darnell who had been a helicopter crew chief and was working in an auto shop and was good at it but felt invisible, like he had gone from being essential to being background. There was a young woman named Priya who had served only 4 years but had seen things in those 4 years that were not measured by length of service, and who had trouble making eye contact but spoke with a precision that stopped every conversation in its tracks. Marcus found himself listening to them with the same attention he had once given to terrain reports. Their problems were real, specific, navigable if someone was paying attention. He found himself, almost without noticing, starting to think about their situations the way he had once thought about operational problems. What are the obstacles? Where are the resources? What does a workable path look like? He mentioned this to Delaney one afternoon after a session, almost as an aside, almost as if he was embarrassed by it. Delaney looked at him steadily. "What you just described," he said, "is exactly what a program coordinator does." Marcus blinked. "I'm not qualified for... You have a degree in organizational management," Delaney said. "I know because I pulled your file after Tuesday. You have 15 years of leadership experience. You have lived every experience in that circle. And you have an instinct for people that I've seen in maybe a dozen individuals in 30 years. He paused. "What exactly are you not qualified for?" The question sat in the air between them. Marcus had spent 14 months thinking of himself as someone who needed help. He had not considered that he might also be someone who could give it, not despite what he had been through, but because of it. The idea rearranged something in the way he was seeing himself, the way you sometimes move a piece of furniture in a room you've lived in for years and are startled to see how much light was blocked that you had simply stopped expecting. He went home that evening and sat in his room and looked at his forearms again. The 7 names, the coordinates, the eagle and the scroll. He thought about what it meant to carry people, not just as a weight, yes, always that, but also as a reason, as a directive, as the answer to the question of why you keep going when going forward doesn't feel like it means anything anymore. He had carried them through a parking lot in Kandahar. He had carried them through 14 months of struggling to find his footing in a country that had forgotten to explain itself to him. He could carry them into this too. 2 days later, he went back to Delaney's office and knocked on the open door. "I want to apply," he said, "for the coordinator position, if it exists." Delaney looked up from his desk. He did not smile, exactly, but something shifted in his expression that was warmer than his usual careful neutrality. "It does now," he said. The next several weeks were not a montage. There was no dramatic transformation, no single moment where Marcus Webb found himself again and everything made sense. Real life does not work that way. And this is a true story, and true stories respect the fact that recovery is not linear, that some days are better than others means that some days are worse, and that the process of rebuilding a sense of purpose after a life structured entirely by service and mission is slow and sometimes painful and requires a tolerance for uncertainty that is a different kind of courage than the battlefield kind. Marcus had bad nights. He had afternoons where the quiet got to him anyway, where the weight of the names felt less like motivation and more like drowning. He had moments and sessions where he was supposed to be helping and instead found himself sitting with the group's pain in a way that reopened his own, and he had to find the discipline to be present for them rather than retreating into himself. He talked to Diane on Thursdays. He told her about the program. He told her about Delaney. He told her about the application. She asked him one Thursday how he was sleeping. He thought about it honestly before answering. Better, he said. And this time, it wasn't a thing added after to soften the not well. It was the actual answer. The morning his application was accepted, a simple email, 3 sentences, Delaney's name at the bottom. Marcus sat with it at the kitchen table in the transitional housing unit with his coffee going cold beside him. He read it twice. Then he looked at his forearms. He thought, "You would have known. You always knew me better than I knew myself." He thought, "I'm still here. I'm still figuring out what that means." He thought, "I'm going to do something with it." Outside the window, the Georgia summer was finally breaking, the trees starting to think about September, the mornings carrying just the first suggestion of the cool that was coming. A dog barked somewhere on the street. A car started. The ordinary world was going about its business the way it always did, indifferent and continuous, and Marcus Webb sat in the middle of it with a coffee cup and an acceptance email and 7 names on his arm, and he felt for the first time in 14 months like he was in the right place. Not a fixed place, not a finished place, but a real place. A place that was moving forward, carrying everything it needed to carry, refusing to leave anyone behind. That had always been the mission. It still was. He got up, rinsed his cup, and went to get dressed for work. 6 months later, Marcus Webb stood at the front of a room that held 37 people, and he was not nervous. This surprised him. He had given briefings in combat conditions, had spoken into radios with buildings falling apart around him, had delivered reports to officers who held careers in their expressions, and gave nothing away. And in all of those situations, the calm had been practiced, disciplined, something he maintained through training, and, well, but this morning, standing in front of 37 veterans who were all looking at him with a particular mix of hope and exhaustion that he recognized the way you recognize your own face, the calm was something different. It came from a different place. It came from belonging. The Warrior to Workforce initiative had grown in the months since Marcus had joined as a program coordinator. What had started as a small local effort organized by Delaney and a handful of volunteers had expanded slowly and deliberately into something with structure and reach. They had secured additional funding from 2 veteran service organizations and a private donor who had lost a nephew in Fallujah and wanted to do something with the grief that wasn't just a plaque. They had partnered with 3 local employers who had agreed not just to hire veterans, but to understand them, to invest in the kind of onboarding and culture work that acknowledged the gap between military and civilian professional environments without treating that gap as a deficit. They had a waiting list. Marcus had helped build this. Not alone. Delaney was the architect. Serena had joined the team and brought her medics precision to the program's wellness components. Darnell had become an informal mentor for veterans transitioning into trades. But Marcus had contributed in ways that were specific and unmistakable. He was good at the thing that was hardest to train. He could sit with a veteran who was falling apart in ways they couldn't articulate and help them feel seen without making them feel small. He could look at a person's military record, their list of skills, their fears, and their history, and find a thread that connected who they had been to who they could become. He had a gift for translation, not between languages, but between identities, between the version of a person built by years of service and the version the civilian world needed them to be able to show. He had been carrying that gift for years without knowing it had a name. The 37 people in the room that morning were the newest cohort, veterans at various stages of transition, from recently separated to years out and still struggling from multiple branches and multiple eras. Some were in their 20s, some were older than Marcus. Some had visible injuries. Most carried their wounds in the places you can't photograph. They had all come because someone had told them this program was real, was different, had helped somebody they knew. Word had moved through the veteran community the way important things do, not through advertising or official channels, but through the quiet networks of people who trust each other because they have been trusted with things that mattered. Marcus looked at them. He thought about the parking lot, the canvas bag, the security guard who had looked at him and seen only what was worn and surface level. He thought about standing on that same asphalt 14 months into a struggle that had no clear enemy and no clear strategy and feeling absolutely alone in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. He thought about a colonel reading 7 names in a parking lot and walking across the heat without hesitation. He had prepared remarks. He had them on a notepad in his jacket pocket, but he looked at the 37 faces and he put his hand in his pocket and closed his fingers around the notepad and kept it there. I'm going to tell you something that no one told me when I got out, he said, and I need you to actually hear it, not just let it go past you the way we let things go past us when we're in survival mode. The room was quiet. The things that made you good over there, the discipline, the situational awareness, the ability to function under pressure, the instinct to protect people around you, the refusal to quit when quitting would be easier. Those things did not expire when your service ended. They're not stored in a uniform that you turned in somewhere. They are in you. They are you. And this world needs them. It needs them badly. It just doesn't always know how to ask for them. He paused. A young woman in the second row was looking at him with an expression he recognized. The expression of someone hearing something they already knew but had been told in 100 indirect ways to doubt. The problem isn't you, Marcus said. The problem is the translation. And that's what we're here to help with. Not to change you, not to make you less of what you are, to help you carry what you are into a room and make sure people understand what they're looking at. He reached up and pushed the sleeve of his button-down shirt back, something he used to do self-consciously, carefully, in a way that managed how much of the ink was visible. He did it plainly now. His forearm was visible, the 7 names in their column, the coordinates, the eagle, and the scroll. These are 7 men I served with, he said. 7 men who didn't come home from a village in Afghanistan in 2014. I carry their names every day. For a long time, I carried them like a weight I was drowning under. And then somebody helped me understand that I was carrying them wrong. But they didn't need me to drown. They needed me to keep going with everything I learned, with everything I am, with every tool they helped teach me, and to do something with it. He looked out at the room. That's why you're here. Not because something is wrong with you. Because something is right with you, and it hasn't found its place yet. We're going to help you find it. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then Serena, who was sitting near the back wall, doing her usual quiet assessment of the room, started clapping. Not the slow, performative kind, but real applause, and the room followed. And for a second, the sound of it filled the space and pushed the weight back. The way sound sometimes can, the way belonging sometimes can in ways that nothing else reaches. Later that day, after the session, after the individual intake meetings, after the logistics and the paperwork and the follow-up calls, Marcus sat in the small office that had been set up for him in the back of the community center. A desk, a bookshelf, a window that looked out onto the parking lot. And he was very still for a while. He could see the spot in the parking lot where Carl had stopped him. He could see where he had stood with his canvas bag unzipped, showing a library book and a water bottle and a piece of paper with his counselor's number on it, and feeling in that moment like a man who had been reduced to the sum of his worst days. He could see where Delaney had walked toward him. He thought about all the people who passed through all the parking lots in the world, carrying things no one can see, being assessed in a single glance by someone who has already decided what they are. He thought about how thin the margin is between a moment that swallows you and a moment that saves you, and how that margin is almost always made by another person. One person who chooses to walk toward instead of away. One person who looks at the ink instead of the worn clothes. One person who asks a real question instead of issuing a dismissal. He thought about how many of those moments never happened. How many people walked away from that parking lot without a Delaney? How many Marcus Webbs were still out there, still carrying the names, still in the crossed-over silence of transition, still waiting for someone to read what was written on them? He opened his desk drawer and pulled out the notepad he had used that first Thursday morning months ago at the transitional housing kitchen table. The one where he had written at the top, "What do I actually know how to do?" The list was still there, exactly as he had written it. He read it. He thought about how little he had believed it when he was writing it. He thought about how he had written it almost against himself, like a man taking an inventory he didn't expect to be useful. He turned to a new page. At the top, he wrote, "What do I still need to do?" He sat with the question for a long time. Outside, the parking lot was quiet, the afternoon moving toward evening, the trees throwing long shadows across the asphalt. A bird landed on the edge of the sidewalk, looked around with the absolute focus of small things, and then flew away. Marcus wrote the first item on the list, find the others who don't know yet that someone's looking for them. That was the mission now. Not a mission handed down from command, not a mission with coordinates and radio codes and extraction protocols. A mission he had given himself, or maybe that had been given to him in a roundabout way by a parking lot, and a colonel, and 7 names, and 14 months of learning how to survive the end of one identity so that something else could begin. He thought about Delaney, who was now, in the strange, circular way that real stories tend to work, becoming something like what Marcus's own men had been. Not a commanding officer, a person who had chosen to show up, a person who had looked at the ink and read it correctly and decided that what he saw was worth a walk across a hot parking lot. There are people in the world who do that. Not many, but they exist, and when you find them or when they find you, the thing that happens is not dramatic. It does not arrive with music or ceremony or clean resolution. It arrives the way most important things arrive, quietly in the middle of an ordinary day when you are not expecting anything and someone walked toward you anyway. Marcus put the pen down. He looked at the list for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Delaney. "I want to talk about expanding the outreach," he said when Delaney picked up. "The transitional housing units, not just this one. There are 12 of them in the county. A lot of people sitting in quiet rooms who don't know the program exists." "I was waiting for you to say that," Delaney said. "How long were you waiting?" A pause. Something in it that might have been a smile. "Since the parking lot," Delaney said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, the evening was coming in, turning the parking lot gold and long-shadowed, and somewhere in the distance a dog was barking the same bark as always, the ordinary world going about its ordinary business. And Marcus Webb sat in the middle of it with his phone and his list and 7 names on his arm, and he felt something that he had once been very afraid he would never feel again. Ready, not finished, not healed in the clean, permanent way that the word implies. Not free of the weight, not done with the bad nights, not past the moments when the quiet goes wrong, and the names feel like they're pulling him under. None of that was resolved in any permanent sense because real life doesn't resolve, it continues. And continuing is its own kind of courage, the unglamorous, daily, stubborn kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside but is everything on the inside. But ready to keep going, ready to be useful, ready to walk across the parking lot toward someone who needed someone to walk toward them. That was enough. That had always been enough. He had just needed to remember it. And sometimes all it takes is one person reading what's written on your skin, reading it slowly, reading it with respect, reading it the way it was meant to be read, to remind you that you were never invisible. You were just in a parking lot where nobody was paying the right kind of attention. Until one afternoon, until a colonel stepped out of a doorway and chose to see, and everything quietly began again.